Coming up next on 60 Minutes.
I remember feeling scared, thinking this just isn't right.
Plummeting to Earth from a kilometre up.
Just looked, somebody's chucked a bag of washing out the aircraft. Shocking.
The frightening parachute accident.
You went to get Victoria a parachute?
Yeah.
That was really a sinister crime.
I couldn't understand why my husband would try and kill me.
Hello and welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm Adam Hegarty and I'm joined at this time around by someone who very intelligently normally avoids the front of the camera, Sammi Taylor, producer. Good
Thanks, Adam.
Now, we have worked on a story that you can, of course, catch on our YouTube channel, as well as 9Now, on Victoria Cilliers, an extraordinary murder plot. She fell out of the sky, her parachute tampered with by her husband, Emil Cilliers. What I found fascinating about this, Sammi, is just the extraordinary double life he lived. What captivated you about this true crime tale?
I think on the surface, Emil Cilliers was a loving, devoted husband to Vicky. All of their friends thought so. All of the people that they went skydiving with, regularly thought so. And so to find that after Vicky's accident, that wasn't actually an accident, that wasn't the case, it was pretty shocking stuff. He basically walked into the first police interview and fessed up to almost everything.
Everything. Not just, he didn't fess up to the murder. Sex workers, mistresses, he was still with his ex-wife, he was juggling a million things.
The amount of detail that the police officers uncovered that he offered up voluntarily, for the most part, is astonishing.
And he almost got away with it, didn't he? I mean, is that scary to think? That shocked me when I was speaking to people.
It's absolutely shocking. And I think, for Vicky to be such an experienced skydiver, first of all, she jumped over 2,500 times. For something to go so horribly wrong with not just her main parachute, but then with her reserve parachute as well, that must have set off alarm bells for every single person, in the skydiving community and all of the people that she was at that airfield with so regularly.
It did indeed. I mean, that was a big part of the investigation, even when we've spoken to people. We went out to Shell Harbour just to have a look at parachutes there to get an idea about this, and the first thing someone there said to me is wait, they took the little slinks out. How on earth? He'd have to know. That has to be someone who knew how to pack a parachute. It was really obvious in hindsight, wasn't it?
It was also really fascinating to see. I've never been skydiving myself.
Yeah, gladly.
I don't know after the story that I will go skydiving.
Sammi Taylor, I'll never go skydiving after this.
I'll hold you to that. I found it fascinating. I'd never seen a skydiving parachute before, and so when we were down at Shell Harbour, looking at the way that they're packed and looking at how tiny those slinks actually are, but how deliberate it would have to be for somebody to go into a parachute, remove them and repack it, all in the 5 minutes or so that Emil had disappeared, with his daughter in the toilet cubicle of at the airfield. It only somebody that really knew parachutes and knew their way around packing parachutes, which is apparently a whole kind of extra skill to have, a really difficult skill to master. Only somebody that knew how to do that could have achieved this.
Exactly, and Emil Cilliers had all that experience, did a packing course of parachutes, and that's part of what led police to him. We hear from Vicky Cilliers, of course, in our story, but we spent a lot of time sitting down with the investigating detectives, Matty Henner and Paul Franklin. What, again, struck me about them is this was 10 years ago, but every question I asked and they responded in such extraordinary detail, didn't they? I mean, it's still so close to them in a way.
I think it's had such a huge impact on both of their lives. They were into this case literally from the very beginning, followed it through, almost 3 years of interviews, court trials, and then even beyond, those 3 years, making sure that Emil wasn't still manipulating Vicky from prison.
That was scary, wasn't it? I mean, even Vicky says in the story that the big moment for her wasn't when he got charged with her attempted murder, it wasn't even when he was found guilty. It was when she took a call from him in jail. That's That's terrifying.
It's really frightening stuff, and I think, Vicky clearly struggled to come to terms with the fact that her husband had tried to do this to her not once but twice. There was the, incident of the gas leak in the home, just a couple of days before the parachute incident as well. But I think, even interviews that Vicky did directly after the verdict was reached, she went on British television and said a couple of things, and you can even see there that she has not come to terms with what's happened to her, and that she still can't accept that her husband is responsible for what's happened to her.
It's sad. It brings us to a really important point about coercive control, but just on Maddie Henner and Paul Franklin, you would have dealt with a lot of police in your time as a producer for 60 Minutes, the amount of investigations that are carried out, but did you get the feeling, like I did, that they were a lot closer to this case, particularly Maddie, than a lot of police would be in any run-of-the-mill case?
Absolutely. I think, Maddie had experienced in those initial interviews with Emil that he had tried to charm her as a female police officer.
I've never heard that before.
I couldn't believe it at all.
He knew he was under investigation for attempted murder and he was trying to flirt with the cop.
Yeah, it's not a good method. I don't think it clearly didn't work for him.
It almost did.
It almost did.
That didn't, but he almost got off.
He did almost get away with it. And I think Maddie was watching Emil act in a very particular way, and assert this control and manipulate his wife. And for Maddie, alarm bells were going off in her own head about her own relationship. She had to do some really kind of personal, growth and go on a bit of a personal journey because of the case that she was dealing with.
Again, this would be close to a lot of women now. Their coercive control is something, of course, we know a lot about now, but perhaps 10 years ago, even particularly with the jury and the friends and family of Vicky, maybe do you think that wasn't something that was too in the fore?
I don't even really think coercive control was within the language of the way that we talk about, domestic abuse and domestic violence in 2015. It's becoming more apparent and more kind of well understood and well known now. But Paul and Maddie really quite instantly recognised Vicky as a victim of coercive control. Paul, in that second trial, told us that he was able to testify as an expert on coercive control and really explain to the jury why Vicky was essentially lying or telling, a very different version of the story that she'd originally told police on the stand. He had to kind of explain why it was that she was being untruthful or why she was keeping things to herself.
Yeah, it's pretty textbook coercive control, and that's even how Paul and Maddie sort of describe it, isn't it? I had a moment doing this story, and I don't know if you did too, but just the thought, it was thrown out that first trial because Vicky took to the stand and said, no, I think I just cut off a perfectly good parachute because she couldn't bring herself to lose Emil. I mean, like, Sammi, as a woman, that must sort of send chills up your spine.
Just the level of control that he had over her and that he was able to exert over her for such a length of time, to be in prison and still be able to have her on your side when you've been convicted of trying to kill her not once but twice. It's really scary stuff. And I know that in speaking with Paul and in speaking with Maddie, their real message from this story, the reason why, they've continued to talk about it for so many years and were happy to come and be a part of the 60 Minutes program is because of how important it is to them that we talk about coercive control and that we, hopefully, somebody that's watching the program and saw what Vicky went through might be able to recognise some of those things in their own life and leave an abusive relationship.
Yeah, it took a while for Vicky to remove herself from it too, right? I mean, yes, that she came to terms with it when she, like I said before, threw down the phone and didn't want to take his calls from prison anymore. She says, I want a divorce, that's it. But, let's talk about this. When we spoke to police and they offered up something pretty new about the situation, didn't they?
Yeah, it was only, the week before we spoke to Maddie and Paul for 60 Minutes that they said Vicky had reached out to them for the first time in almost 6 years to thank them for saving her life and for saving the life of her children. And it just goes to show that Vicky's a very accomplished, very intelligent, very lovely woman who it's taken her 6 years to come to terms with the fact that she was a victim of coercive control. And not only that, but, you know, recognising the help of people who, when she went into court and spoke against them, essentially, you know, she wasn't able to see that what they were trying to do was to help her and to save her life.
It's pretty lovely from the police too, isn't it? I think I asked them, you know, did you want to tear your hair out when she was on the stand? And you could tell, couldn't you, when even though they would have been really annoyed in the situation and said, no, we remained stoic, probably because they're police, but also because they felt so sorry for Vicky in that situation.
Of course, and I think, you know, being police officers, they've dealt with victims of domestic violence and domestic abuse relationships probably quite frequently. Yeah. And so seeing a victim of coercive control, it wasn't as if they were seeing it for the first time. They were able to identify that, I think, in her quite quickly and didn't hold it against her in any way. How could you, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so extensive, wasn't it? You almost couldn't fit it all into the story, the examples of his coercive control. 100%. One of the ones that stuck with me is incredibly complicated, but really quite important as a bit of background, is the idea that he searched for wet nurses. Like, he knew what he was doing.
Bizarre. So, in the days leading up to the sabotaging of the parachute, you know, Emil goes online and looks up wet nurses in the UK, you know, essentially women that could breastfeed his 5-week-old son, because he was anticipating that Vicky wouldn't be around to do that anymore. Like, it's really cold, it's really callous and awful. And
still exerting that control, right? It always comes back to that. I mean, when you talk about the gas leak you mentioned earlier, the kids were in the house, so they were in danger. Had, you know, Vicky turned on the stove with the leaking gas, it would have potentially blown up the house with the kids inside. But then, not long after, just days after, he's looking up wet nurses to try and support his child. It's a weird insight into his mind.
The way that the police described it to us was almost as if when Vicky didn't bite on the gas leak, you know, she texted him saying that she could smell gas, and he texted back and said, well, have you tried turning the stove on? Awful. That, you know, once that obviously didn't work, and once that was not going to achieve the outcome that he wanted, it's almost as if he started plotting straight away. Well, what can I do next? You know, how can I, cause Vicky's life to end? And the parachute was, you know, the next option.
Yeah, you touched on it a bit before too. I mean, obviously a big part of this story, and why we looked at it, is it's just such a fascinating example of true crime, but it really does send a strong message, doesn't it? I mean, the police tried to get that across with our interview, but what message do you think it sends young women in coercive relationships? Yeah, no,
I think at the end of the day, despite all of the kind of twists and turns that this story has, and it has a lot of them,
sure does.
It's a story about coercive control, and it's a story about a woman who really, really struggled for years and years and years to kind of break free of the grip of her husband, who was controlling, who was manipulative, who was abusive. And the hope, I think, at least for the police officers and the people that continue to speak out about this case, is that if anyone recognises signs like Vicky, you know, of coercive control in their own relationships, that there are places that they can go for help, that there are people that they can talk to, and most of all, that what they're experiencing is a form of domestic abuse, of domestic violence.
And these days they'll be believed. That's a pretty important message, isn't it? Yeah, good
100%.
Point. Good point to end on. Sammi Taylor, well done.
Thanks,
Thank
Adam.
you. Thank you. Good chat. And of course, just to repeat, you can catch our story on our YouTube channel, of course, but also on 9 Now.